My husband's assistant's purse was under our bed, and $70,000 had quietly vanished from our accounts. I felt the leather against my toes before I saw it a wrong shape in the dark of our bedroom in Westerville, Ohio. The house was so still, it sounded fake. Emily slept down the hall with her white noise machine humming, and Tyler was supposed to be out, late entertaining suppliers for his family's HVAC business. I knelt, reached under the bed, and pulled the purse into the lamplight. Structured, expensive young. Not mine. I had seen it before on the shoulder of his assistant in the office lobby, attached to the girl everyone called efficient and hungry, Kayla Hart. 26, perfect hair, perfect confidence, perfectly placed in my husband's calendar and my mother-in-law's praise. I opened the clasp. Her company ID sat on top her smile, bright above the logo of Lee Heating and Supply. Under it was a folded receipt. Hotel Levesque, downtown Columbus. King Suite double occupancy. The date sat in the center of the page like a bruise. It was the same night Tyler told me he had to fly to Chicago for an emergency meeting. I could still see myself packing him a sandwich because he said airport food was too expensive. On the back of the receipt was a square of hotel notepaper, one line written in a sharp feminine hand. Cannot wait until your freedom night. K. My throat tightened. Freedom night. Not our freedom. His, theirs. A private joke about the evening they would cut me out and call it growth. This was not just cheating. This was planning. This was a script. I set the purse on the bed and walked to the kitchen, the tile cold under my feet. I did not make coffee. I opened our banking app. The numbers came up in neat, blue rows, all the ways I had trusted him laid out in plain text. For months there had been small transfers I had ignored. Life is busy, money moves. You tell yourself it is nothing. Tonight they lined up like a confession. $1,800 from joint savings to T. Lee personal. $2,200, $1,900. Again and again, every few weeks, always just under the limit that would trigger a warning. I scrolled back 6 months and did the math. Roughly $70,000 gone. A slow, quiet bleed. I tapped into Emily's 529 college account, the one I treated like a locked box around her future. The balance was lower than it should have been. Several transfers out matched the days I had moved money in every little victory I had felt when I clicked submit. He was not just hiding money, he was siphoning from his own child to pay for hotel rooms where his assistant wrote about freedom nights. My finger hovered over the shared calendar icon. When I opened it, the last pieces slid into place. This Saturday, 3 days from now, 15th anniversary, Hyde Park Steakhouse private room. In the notes section, Tyler had left instructions for the restaurant. Parents, champagne, announcement, freedom night. I could see it like a scene from a toxic family drama I had not agreed to be in. The private room just off the main floor in downtown Columbus. Dark wood, white tablecloth, waiters moving in and out. Ron and Paula in their country club, best ready to look sad and reasonable, while Tyler talked about how we had grown apart, how he would always care for me, how sometimes love meant letting go. They would tell themselves I was emotional, difficult, unstable. They would dress family betrayal up as concern and call it clean. Clean for them, not for me, not for Emily. A notification banner slid across the top of my screen, calm and bright in the middle of my shaking hands. Dividend payment received from Mara Jensen Consulting. Amount $84,000. It was the quarterly payout from the company I had helped build before I ever became the safe, helpful financial aid advisor at the community college, the part of my life I kept in my maiden name, so no one in the Lee family could reach for it. Scholar Bridge. Years of work turned into an 8-figure stake I almost never mentioned. I stared at the number while Kayla's purse sat open upstairs and Tyler's transfers glowed on my screen. The story-financial truth of my life snapped into focus. Somewhere in this city, my husband thought he was winning. He thought he had written the ending of this revenge story that his parents and his assistant would stand around my pain and call it necessary. He thought I would sit in that private room, stay quiet, and accept my own erasure. I woke up the next morning with the imprint of the purse still haunting the back of my mind, and the numbers 70,000 circling like a quiet storm. And even as I brushed my teeth and packed Emily's lunch, I felt the weight of everything that had shifted during the night. Although the house looked the same, the sun rose the same over the quiet Westerville streets, and the air smelled like the same early autumn cold. But something inside me no longer fit into the version of myself that Tyler and his family spent years shaping the version they preferred, the version they could control. My name is Mara Lee, 40 years old mother of one resident of Westerville, on the northern side of Columbus, where the lawns are modest and the houses are neat. And the community college where I work stands at the center of so many ordinary lives. And for anyone looking in from the outside, it seems like I am exactly what people assume. At first glance, a kind patient, financial aid advisor who helps students figure out how to pay for school. Someone who smiles easily and wears cardigans and carries folders and explains forms to scared teenagers and stressed parents. Someone whose life looks small and safe and tucked into a quiet neighborhood with a small backyard and a low mortgage and a simple rhythm. That is the surface story, and it is the only version the Lee family ever bothered to see, because it allowed them to believe in their own narrative that they were the powerful ones, that their business was the real source of money and legacy, that Tyler had married a woman who should feel grateful for the stability they offered. What they did not know, and never cared to learn, was the truth that existed quietly behind the curtain of my married life, a truth I had protected so thoroughly that not even Tyler understood the full shape of it. Before I married him, before I took his last name and moved into the orbit of his parents and their small-town kingdom, I had already built something that started in a tiny shared apartment near Ohio State University when I was 24 and working 3 part-time jobs while creating an online platform to match low-income students with scholarship opportunities. A project that grew out of anger at the obstacles I had seen my friends face and out of stubbornness that refused to accept how financial aid systems shut people out. That project became ScholarBridge, and in the early years it was messy and exhausting and chaotic. But eventually it caught attention, and mentorship and funding, and 7 years ago it was bought by a national education group for a number that made the room spin when the papers were placed in front of me. A number that changed my life and sent me into a new chapter as a strategic advisor with 15% equity that kept growing in value year after year. A quiet river of dividends that landed in the account under my maiden name, Mara Jensen. Consulting money I never touched for lifestyle or show money I saw as a responsibility, not a luxury money. Tyler knew about but never truly paid attention to because he assumed it was small, assumed because my job title sounded humble that my influence must be equally small. ScholarBridge now sits valued in the 8-figure range, and my stake in it is worth several $1 million with quarterly payouts that rival the yearly profit of the Lee family business. Yet to Ron and Paula, I was always the girl who filled out paperwork, the woman who did not understand business, the wife who should step aside while Tyler stepped into the spotlight they had prepared for him since birth. Ron Lee carried himself like the unofficial mayor of Westerville, even though their company was simply a mid-sized HVAC supplier with a long history but shallow reach, and he walked into every room as if he owned the oxygen, while Paula floated behind him like the keeper of social order, policing every expression, every tone, every moment of conversation. From the day Tyler brought me home, she kept her smile tight and her words tighter. The kind of woman who believed deeply in hierarchy and believed even more deeply that she sat near the top of it. And it did not take long for me to understand I would always be placed one step below her son, no matter how much I accomplished. Their disregard became routine, as casual as the way Paula would pat my arm and say that Emily would learn to be graceful like Lee women if guided correctly, or the way Ron would talk to me about budgeting as though I did not have a degree in financial systems and a career built entirely on helping people escape predatory debt patterns. But the moment that solidified the truth of where I stood happened a year ago during a dinner at their house, a night I can still replay scene by scene. We had finished eating and the table was crowded with empty plates and half-filled glasses when Ron decided to talk about legacy, a topic he returned to with the same pride each time describing who would inherit what and how the future of the company depended on family loyalty. And he leaned back in his chair and announced that when the time came, everything would pass to Tyler because it had to stay in the Lee bloodline, and there was no hesitation in his voice because in his mind, this was natural law. I asked gently what that meant for Emily, wondering if they ever thought beyond their son, wondering if they recognized that she, too, carried their name and their future. And Paula answered with a laugh that skimmed the surface of cruelty, saying that Emily would marry well, and that would be her inheritance, as though her granddaughter's entire worth was dependent on the eventual approval of some man. I remember feeling something heavy settle in my chest, a mix of disgust and cold clarity. And while the conversation drifted onward toward the company's community outreach fund, Paula introduced me to a couple from church by saying, "This is Mara. She helps poor kids fill out forms. Sweet, isn't it?" And the couple nodded politely without knowing that the forms I created in Scholar Bridge were used across the entire state, without knowing that I had built something that changed lives far beyond the reach of the cozy little circle we sat in. That night, when the dishes were cleared and the guests had left, and Paula stood in her kitchen bragging about the Lee Family Scholarship Fund, a fund they expected me to praise, I excused myself quietly to the porch and sent an email to the Scholar Bridge Board suggesting a new scholarship in honor of my mother, a woman they had never bothered to ask about a woman who taught me to fight gently, but fight all the same. And a week later, when the press release came out, featuring my mother's name without a single mention of the Lee family, I felt a small spark of satisfaction, barely a revenge, but enough to remind me of who I was beneath the role they had tried to press onto me. I said nothing to Tyler or his parents, just smiled when Paula complained that the board had not returned her calls about naming rights, and I stored the moment away like a seed, a quiet reminder that they did not own my story. In their version of our family, I was the background character, the quiet wife standing at the edge of photographs, the person whose contributions dissolved into the shadow of their son. But in the life I had built long before marrying him, I was a founder, a strategist, a woman whose work touched thousands of students and who held influence they never imagined. And I realized, sitting there, that the only reason they could pretend otherwise was because I had let them, because I had chosen silence for peace, and because I had not yet turned my strength toward the toxic family that mistook my quiet for weakness. I remember telling myself as I drove to Ron and Paula's house that my 40th birthday deserved something simple and warm, because 40 was a strange age that balanced between youth and the beginning of a deeper steadiness. And I wanted to believe this family dinner would be about that steadiness, about the years I had carried Emily through illnesses and school projects and late-night fears, while supporting Tyler through his promotions and disappointments, about the countless weekends I spent helping the Lee family with errands and events, because I thought that was what marriage meant. But the moment I stepped into their house, I felt the familiar shift, the unseen hand that pushed me to the outer edge of every room, and I knew before I took off my coat that the night would not belong to me. Paula swept in with a smile so polished it felt rehearsed, complimenting my dress in that soft, clipped tone she used when she wanted to sound kind, while reminding me she had chosen a different dress for Maggie last Christmas, because Maggie had better color sense, and she guided me toward the dining room where Ron and Tyler were already talking loudly about the family business, as if the rest of us were props arranged to applaud at the right moments. The table was set with candles and the heavy dishes Paula used only on holidays, and for a moment I let myself hope they had done all this for me. But within minutes, the truth revealed itself as naturally as breathing, because every conversation circled back to Tyler, his meetings, his projections, his role in saving the company during the past year. Ron spoke with the confidence of a man who had never questioned his own authority, telling the story of how the company would have collapsed if not for what he called the capital injection Tyler brought in years ago. And Paula clasped her hands dramatically as she said, "We are so lucky. Tyler brought in that extra capital. Without it, the company would not have survived." And she said it proudly, as though she had witnessed her son lift a burning building off its foundation with his bare hands. I sat there in the candlelight, smiling in a way that hurt my cheeks while my stomach tightened, because the capital they praised him for bringing in was mine. The $250,000 I had moved from the sale of my Scholar Bridge shares into their company account 7 years before the money I had earned and chosen to invest, because Tyler convinced me it would earn us respect in his family. I could still hear him saying, "If we invest some of your bonus into the company, Dad will finally respect us." And I had believed him because I was newly married and hopeful and naive about how money can be twisted when placed in the hands of people who think legacy is their birthright. That night, listening to Paula retell the story as if Tyler had sacrificed his own savings, as if I had simply been in the kitchen cooking, while the men saved the world, I felt the betrayal take on a shape bigger than my own marriage, a shape woven into the drama of inheritance and entitlement that the Lee family lived, by a shape that pressed me farther and farther out of the frame. The humiliation continued with the same unthinking ease they had mastered over the years, small enough that they could claim innocence, but sharp enough that I felt each cut. And when Emily shyly handed me the drawing she had made at school, a watercolor of the two of us holding hands under a bright sky, my daughter's sweet attempt at celebrating me, Paula took the picture and held it up for the table to see smiling with that saccharine tone she reserved for undermining me, and said, "She has your kind heart." Mara let us hope she finds a man like Tyler to actually take care of her, and the entire table laughed as if this was simply harmless fun, as if diminishing me in front of my child was acceptable entertainment. I swallowed, hard-kissed Emily's head, and held on to the drawing as if it were a lifeline, silently promising myself she would never grow up believing that her worth depended on a man's approval. After dinner, Paula announced that Maggie and I should help clean up, while the men discussed business, a routine that had been repeated so many times it felt scripted. But that night, something inside me refused to move in the old pattern. And instead of quietly cleaning the entire kitchen, as I had done for years, I washed only the plates used by our family, stacking them neatly and leaving the rest untouched. Paula returned 10 minutes later, surprise flickering across her face as she looked at the pile of dirty dishes and then at me, and said, "Mara, you missed a few things," her voice sharpening the way it always did when she sensed rebellion. But I simply smiled, a small, tight smile, born from exhaustion and awakening, and said I figured the real decision-makers could handle the real mess, letting the words land between us in a calm tone that offered no apology. She blinked, thrown off balance for a moment, and in that second, I realized how rarely I had pushed back, how long I had let their narrative stand unchallenged, and how satisfying it felt to take back even a sliver of my own space. The rest of the evening passed in a polite haze, the kind that hides resentment behind forced smiles, and when Tyler and I finally drove home through the quiet residential streets, he talked excitedly about the praise he had received, about how his parents were proud of him for everything he was doing for the company, never once acknowledging the way they had erased me from the very story I had helped finance. I sat in the passenger seat watching the reflections of streetlights slide across the windshield, feeling a mixture of sadness and clarity settle over me. And when we reached home and I stepped inside, the first thing I heard was the soft buzz of Tyler's phone on the counter where he had placed it. The screen lit up with a message he did not bother hiding, a message that arrived with the casual intimacy of a shared secret, and the notification read, "Good job tonight," with a winking smile from Kayla, the assistant, whose purse I would later find under our bed. And in that moment, the pieces clicked together in a way that made my skin prickle, because it was suddenly so clear that she was not just an assistant, not just a coworker, but someone he had been priming and praising and folding into our family story long before I realized the script had changed. The shift in Tyler began so quietly that at first I blamed myself for imagining it, telling myself that maybe the long hours at the community college had worn me thin, or that the strain of keeping peace in a family that never truly let me belong had left my thoughts too sensitive. But as the weeks moved on after that birthday disaster, I felt the air in our house tighten in subtle ways, and each small moment gathered force, like pebbles rolling together into something heavier. One evening after dinner, when Emily was in her room working on a science project and the house felt peaceful for the first time that day, Tyler cleared his throat the way he did when he was about to present something as a logical solution. And he said that he had been thinking about how to streamline our finances, saying in a careful, measured voice that it would be simpler if he handled our savings accounts and investments, and I took care of groceries and utility bills, since I was already good with the day-to-day details. I smiled politely, even though something in me tightened, because I had spent my entire career teaching students how to avoid predatory traps, and I recognized the tone of a person who wanted control without having to justify why. A few days later, Paula echoed his plan during Sunday lunch when she announced that in every strong family, men handle assets and women handle receipts, saying it as though it were a universal truth delivered straight from the universe. And Tyler nodded with that quiet, satisfied smile that always appeared when his mother backed him up. I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt because marriage is built on trust, or at least that is what I repeated to myself. But not long after, I began to notice small transfers in our online banking history numbers that would typically slip under any radar, a few hundred here, a few hundred there, always with vague descriptions like temporary move or budget adjustment. At first, I asked him gently about the transactions, and he brushed them away with an easy laugh, reminding me that he handled investments now and that it was nothing to worry about. But when I pressed a little harder one evening, because I could not shake the feeling that something was wrong, his entire demeanor snapped from pleasant to hostile, with a speed that sent a chill through me. He turned on me with wide, offended eyes and asked, "Do you think I am stealing from you from our child that is sick, Mara?" And the way he said sick made me feel as though questioning him was a moral failure on my part, the kind of gaslighting I had seen in so many of the broken families who came into my office seeking financial help after a divorce. I tried to de-escalate because I did not want Emily hearing raised voices so late at night, but Tyler kept pushing, reminding me of every time I had forgotten a bill or asked him to pick up groceries after work, using small, ordinary moments as evidence that I was unreasonable to question him. The argument built until he threw his hands up in frustration, accidentally knocking a glass off the counter, and it shattered on the tile floor, sending a sharp splinter across my hand before I could move, leaving a thin red line along my skin. He froze, apologized, then immediately blamed the entire moment on me, saying, "If you did not talk about money all the time, maybe things would not get this tense." And although the cut was shallow, the moment carved something deeper inside me. A growing recognition that the emotional imbalance in our home was no longer small or temporary, but something more dangerous. Later that week, an email arrived from the bank addressed to both of us with the subject line, "Change in 529 contribution schedule." And even before I opened it, I felt a wave of dread, because the 529 account was sacred to me. The one place where every dollar meant Emily's future, every contribution meant possibility, and opening that message felt like opening a crack in the foundation of our family. The notice said contributions had been paused, and when I confronted Tyler about it, He shrugged and said the market was unstable and that he was only pausing things, temporarily telling me trust me, and using the kind of tone husbands use when they want obedience rather than understanding. I wanted to believe him because I had built a whole identity around being supportive and patient and reliable, and I thought maybe this was another moment where I was supposed to be the flexible one, the calm one, the wife who steadied the ship. But inside, something kept whispering that the ship was not drifting but being steered away from me inch by inch. The contrast between my daily work and my home life felt sharper every day, because at work I spent hours guiding strangers toward financial safety, making sure they understood how to protect their future. While back home, I could not see that my own husband was quietly reshaping ours without speaking a word. One small act of quiet pushback surfaced almost without planning when Paula asked if I could recommend Lee Heating and Supply as a sponsor for a new scholarship event connected to a statewide college initiative, expecting me to use my network to uplift the family business yet again. Instead of forwarding their name, I referred a small competing HVAC company I knew offered better terms, and the committee not only accepted them, but celebrated the partnership in a local paper, leaving Ron perplexed and annoyed that his company had been overlooked for what he considered an inferior competitor. I said nothing when he complained about the lost opportunity during family dinner, pretending I knew nothing of the process, but inside, I felt a small flicker of defiance, a private reminder that even in the smallest ways, I could choose not to hand them the victories they felt entitled to. Late one night, after Emily had fallen asleep and the house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, I sat at the dining table reviewing FAFSA forms for a student who was terrified of losing financial aid, and as I worked through the numbers, I felt a tear slip down my cheek because the truth settled heavily on me. I could help strangers protect their future, guiding them through every loophole and warning sign. Yet in my own life, I had missed the signals, overlooked the transfers, ignored the pauses, convinced myself that loyalty meant silence. I stared at the glowing screen and whispered to myself that I could help strangers protect their future, but I could not see my own husband quietly rewriting mine. The night I finally decided to pull, every bank statement felt colder than it actually was, the kind of cold that settles beneath the skin and makes the air feel unfamiliar. And I sat at the kitchen table long after Emily had gone to bed, long after the neighborhood lights had dimmed, listening only to the quiet click of the printer as page after page slid out with the evidence of what I already feared. I spread the papers across the table in rows and columns, like a map of a place I had lived in without understanding the terrain, and with a yellow highlighter in my hand, I moved slowly down each line, marking the transfers that had looked insignificant when viewed alone, but transformed into a confession when placed side by side: $1,800, $2,200, $1,900, again and again, with the same vague descriptions about temporary moves that never seemed to move back, and as the yellow marks grew brighter on the page, I felt the truth tighten around me, $70,000 siphoned out of the life I believed we were building together. I paused when I reached the transfers that matched the dates I had contributed to Emily's 529 plan, the little celebrations I made each time I moved money into that account, telling myself that no matter what happened in our marriage, her education would be safe, her future protected, and now the numbers stared back at me with a cruel clarity because the drops in the 529 balance matched the rises in Tyler's personal account. I logged into the plan itself, watching the projected balance shrink compared to what it should have been feeling. Something inside me crumbled as I realized he had been using our daughter's college fund like a private pool of cash, dipping into it whenever he needed to sustain whatever life he was building with Kayla or to fund whatever narrative he was preparing for our so-called anniversary dinner. I looked at the shared calendar on my phone, the event for our 15th anniversary, highlighted in soft gold, as if it were something worth celebrating, and when I opened the details, the notes sat there, in neat, black letters. Private room, parents, Champagne, quick announcement, keep it clean, and I felt my pulse thicken in my throat because it was not a dinner to honor our years together. It was a stage set for my removal. I remembered a comment Paula made years earlier at a barbecue when one of her friends mentioned divorce, and Paula, without lowering her voice, said that if a wife becomes a liability, a man has to clean it up quietly. And the women around her had laughed as though this were practical wisdom rather than cruelty wrapped in charm, and now that sentence echoed in my mind with a new and chilling weight. I sat with the papers spread out before me, imagining how they intended the night to unfold, picturing Tyler standing in that private dining room at Hyde Park Steakhouse, putting a hand on my shoulder with a rehearsed tenderness, while he told our friends and his parents that he still cared for me. But that sometimes marriages drift apart, imagining Paula clasping her hands in that performative sadness she used so well as she said we tried everything. Imagining Ron shaking his head with the disappointment of a patriarch forced into difficult decisions. Imagining the guests nodding sympathetically as they watched the wife who had supposedly become unstable or difficult or overly emotional, all of them believing a script that had been prepared without my knowledge. The thought of it made me grip the edge of the table because this was not just infidelity, it was a betrayal, carved with deliberate steps, a betrayal wrapped in the appearance of respectability, a betrayal that turned my life into a performance where I was meant to accept humiliation with grace, and the cruelty of it broke something that had been holding me together. I needed air, so I pushed the papers aside and opened my laptop, logging into the Scholar Bridge dashboard, the place where the parts of my life that belonged solely to me still existed untouched. And as the screen lit up, I saw notifications from the board messages about next year's leadership, restructuring an invitation draft, naming me as their intended chair of the board, a role that would place me at the head of a $40 million scholarship portfolio, a responsibility that would shape the futures of thousands of students. I stared at the screen and felt a strange mix of pride and grief because the same woman who was being positioned to lead an 8-figure educational initiative was treated in her own home as though she were a dependent to be managed, a liability to be removed. I whispered into the empty kitchen I was about to oversee $40 million. But in this house, they still treated me like a line item they could write off, and the words tasted bitter and liberating at once, because saying them aloud made the truth impossible to ignore. My breathing steadied little by little as I kept looking at the screen, letting the reality of my professional life anchor me, reminding me that I was not the fragile figure Tyler and his parents wanted the world to see. The weight of the betrayal settled around me again, but instead of dragging me down, it clarified my thoughts, and in that clarity, I felt the first spark of something that resembled resolve. I knew I could not confront them yet, not while they held the narrative in their hands, not while they believed I was still willing to play my assigned role, so I made a quiet decision, a small one, but one that carried symbolic power over my own sense of autonomy. I opened the online portals for every system that had Tyler listed as my emergency contact, the community college, the district office, the medical portals, the parent volunteer accounts, and one by one I removed his name and replaced it with Rachel's, the colleague who had sat with me through so many long nights during registration season, the woman I trusted without hesitation. It was such a simple act that no one else would notice a change, buried deep in forms that no one checks unless something has gone terribly wrong. But for me, it marked the first moment I formally separated my safety from his presence, the first moment I withdrew authority from a man who had assumed he always had it. When I finished updating the last account, I closed my laptop and looked again at the papers scattered across the table. The highlighted lines, the disappearing college fund, the notes for the anniversary that was never meant to celebrate me. And I felt the dark tunnel around me narrow, not to crush me, but to show me that there was only one direction left to move, one that required silence now and strength later. By the time the sun came up the next morning, I had not really slept. I had drifted in and out of a shallow fog with the images of highlighted bank statements and that cruel calendar note hovering just behind my eyes, and somewhere between 3 and 4, a clear sentence formed in my mind. I needed someone who understood how money and power really worked, someone who was not afraid of a toxic family that wrapped its abuse in respectability. So after I dropped Emily at school and smiled through the small talk with other parents, I sat in my car in the parking lot and typed the name I had heard whispered more than once in connection with messy divorces and complicated assets. Janet Cole, downtown Columbus. Her assistant answered on the second ring, and there must have been something in my voice when I said I needed to discuss a potential divorce and complex marital property, because instead of offering me an appointment next week, she asked if I could come in at 11. I said yes before I could talk myself out of it. Then drove home, grabbed Kayla's purse, the printed hotel receipt, the stack of highlighted statements, the screenshots of the 529 changes, and the note from the anniversary reservation, slid them into my leather work tote and headed downtown, my hands tight on the wheel as if I could squeeze my fear into the steering column. The Cole & Associates office was on one of those glass-walled floors that catch the light from the Scioto River, all clean lines and quiet intimidation. And for a moment in the elevator, I felt small the way Paula always made me feel when she talked about real money and real decisions. But when I stepped into the reception area and the assistant led me back to a corner office, something shifted, because the woman who stood to greet me did not look at me the way my in-laws did. She looked at me like an equal coming to discuss a problem. She was tall, silver-haired, around 58 if I had to guess, wearing a navy suit that said she had seen every version of marital disaster and survived them all, and when I held out my hand and said my name, she hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then a slow recognition lit her expression. "You are Mara Jensen," she said, not asking, but stating from Scholar Bridge. "I have read your work on student loan ethics. You wrote that series on predatory repayment plans. It made the rounds in our firm, and for the first time since I found that purse under my bed, my spine straightened just a little, because here was someone who knew me, not as the quiet wife, but as the woman who had built something. I almost laughed at the contrast. My husband and his family saw me as the person who helped kids fill out forms, and this stranger in a glass office saw me as the strategist behind a national conversation about debt and fairness. And that alone made me sit down in the leather chair with a different kind of courage. I laid the tote on my lap, opened it, and began to take out my exhibits like I was presenting a storyfinancial case study. Kayla's sand-colored purse with her company badge still tucked in the pocket, the printed receipt from the hotel downtown that matched the night of the supposed Chicago trip, the pages of statements with yellow streaks where $70,000 had walked away in small, quiet increments, the screenshots showing the 529 contributions dropping off while those transfers picked up, and finally the printout of our shared calendar event with the words private room and parents and champagne and quick announcement. They think I said, surprised at how steady my voice sounded, that I am just a college advisor who should be grateful Tyler takes care of the real money. They think I am soft enough to sit through a humiliating announcement and then sign whatever they slide across the table. They think this is their revenge story, money that they can move assets, use my daughter's future like an ATM, and still control how I look when it all comes crashing down. Janet did not interrupt me. She listened with her hands folded, her face still, and when I finished, she leaned back slightly and let out a quiet, controlled breath. "This," she said, "is a pattern. I know very well, this is not just infidelity. This is a toxic family strategy. They build a narrative where the wife is overly emotional or unstable. They surround her with witnesses, assistants, parents, sometimes even pastors or neighbors, who will nod along when the husband claims he did everything he could, and then they stage a public moment, a neat little performance, so that when she reacts like any human would, they can call it proof. My stomach twisted because she had just described exactly what I had seen in my mind the night before the performance at Hyde Park. The sympathetic faces, the gaslighting dressed up as concern, the betrayal, family karma of people who hurt you, then act shocked when you bleed and something hot and sharp moved under my ribs. Not shame this time, anger. The good news, she continued, and her tone shifted from analysis to planning, is that you, Mara, are not the woman they think you are. You are not financially dependent. You have your own assets, your own network. You understand numbers better than they do. And we are going to use that. This is not going to be the usual case where we beg them for fairness. This is conflict justice. And you are going to walk in prepared. She outlined it in clear steps. We would open a new account at a bank with no connection to the Lee family, not their favorite branch, where everyone knows Ron, but a credit union or private bank that answered only to me. Then we would transfer exactly half of every liquid joint asset into my name, savings checking any money market funds tied to both of us, labeling it as a personal investment portfolio, making sure the paper trail was clean and lawful, because under Ohio law I had every right to my 50%, especially after he had been quietly bleeding funds out of the same accounts. "You are not stealing," she said firmly. When I hesitated, he already began the dissolution of assets. He just did it in the dark and called it family responsibility. You will do it in the light and call it what it is, a partner reclaiming her equity. We would also copy everything she said, and her voice took on that precise edge I recognized from my own work backups of every bank statement, every 529 records showing the changed contributions, screenshots of the shared calendar, copies of the text messages and emails that hinted at Kayla's role, multiple copies stored in different safe places. Because when people like this feel their grip slipping, they try to erase the evidence, and we were not going to let them rewrite this story. I asked almost reluctantly, should I confront him before the dinner, tell him, I know, cancel the reservation part of me still craving a simple fight instead of this slow revenge story. But Janet shook her head. "Not yet," she said. "You will say nothing. You will let them go ahead with their little plan. You will let them believe you are still inside their script, because the more confident they are, the sloppier they become. And we want them at full arrogance when the truth lands. That is how you get real leverage, not just emotional revenge, emotional satisfaction, but legal power." The words real leverage settled into my chest like a weight I wanted to carry, and then she added a smaller twist, almost as an afterthought, but with a glint in her eyes that made me feel unexpectedly seen. After everything breaks open and the filings are in motion, we will also make some changes that will feel petty to them, but will drive the lesson home. She said, you will cancel his supplemental credit card. You will remove your name from any auto pay that props up his image. The gym he never uses but brags about the golf club membership. His father insists makes him a serious man. The streaming services he assumes are just there. You will redirect those little streams of convenience back to yourself. It will not make headlines, but it will remind him every single day that the quiet background character he took for granted was actually the one keeping his comfort running. I felt an almost guilty thrill at the idea, not because of the money itself, but because of what it represented every time his card was declined or his club called to ask about payment. He would remember that the woman he tried to paint as weak had the power to close the tap, and that small daily sting felt like an appropriate prelude to the larger reckoning coming. When we had gone through every document and every step, and she had given me a list of tasks for the next 48 hours, she closed the folder, met my eyes, and said the sentence that finally flipped a switch in me. You help kids fight predatory loans. Mara, you have spent years protecting strangers from being trapped by fine print and bad faith contracts. This time, we are going to treat your husband and his family like the predatory lenders they are. We will not scream at them. We will not beg them. We will hold them to the terms they thought only applied to everybody else. I walked out of her office into the bright light over the river, no longer feeling like a woman stumbling through a dark tunnel. I felt like a strategist carrying a new kind of playbook, one where I did not wait for their mercy, one where my quiet work, my numbers, my patience, became the very tools that would dismantle the story they had written for me. In the 2 days after meeting Janet, I felt a different kind of clarity settle into my bones, a steadiness that came not from anger alone, but from finally understanding the scale of what had been happening around me. And with that clarity came a need to dig deeper, because every instinct told me that the $70,000 and the anniversary setup were only the most recent layers of a pattern that had begun long before I ever found Kayla's purse under my bed. One evening after Emily fell asleep and the house finally stilled, I opened my laptop and went through old emails I had not looked at in years, scrolling past newsletters and outdated reminders until I reached the time immediately after I had transferred the $250,000 from my Scholar Bridge payout into the Lee Company account. And there, in a folder marked Company Materials, was a PDF I did not remember receiving an internal memo titled Family Capital Injection, with a neat summary beneath it, crediting Tyler Lee for the contribution that kept the company afloat that quarter. And I stared at that line, reading it and rereading it, as the realization settled like a stone in my stomach, because this was the proof I had always sensed, but never named, that they had taken my money, my work, my sacrifice, and folded it silently under his name. On paper, it was as if I had never existed, as if the contribution had come from his brilliance or his savings or his strategic thinking, and I felt a wave of betrayal wash over me that was almost worse than the $70,000 he had stolen recently, because this was not just secrecy. This was erasure, deliberate and convenient, and aligned with every little dismissal Paula had ever made about my role in the family. And as I sat there staring at the memo, another face came to mind, someone who had disappeared from the Lee family orbit with the same quiet efficiency they were now trying to use on me. A cousin named Mark Lee, around 46. Now, if I remembered correctly, a man who had worked in the company years ago but had vanished from dinners and holidays without explanation. Whenever his name came up, Paula would raise her eyebrows and say he could not handle the pressure, or he was always unstable, or we do not talk about him, and the conversation would shift as if he had never existed. Something about that old discomfort resurfaced as I stared at the memo, so I searched my messages again and found an old thread where he had once sent Ron and Tyler a suggestion about tightening inventory reports, and without thinking too long, I sent him a simple note. I need to talk to you about something that happened in the family company. Can we meet? And to my surprise, he replied within the hour, suggesting a small diner off Route 3, where he said the Lees never set foot. The next afternoon, I drove there with a growing tension in my chest, and when I walked in, I saw him sitting in a booth near the window, a little older, a little tired around the eyes, but still carrying the same quiet intelligence I remembered from years ago. He stood when I reached the table, and after we sat, he looked at me for a long moment as though trying to decide where to begin, then said, "You must have found something, or you would not be here." I told him everything. The $70,000, the transfers out of the college fund, the purse, the hotel receipt, the anniversary setup, the memo crediting Tyler with my $250,000. And as I spoke, he nodded slowly. Not surprised, only saddened. Like a man hearing the next chapter of a story he'd already lived. When I finished, he leaned back, folded his hands, and said they did the same thing to me. I found out years ago that Ron was using company funds to cover personal expenses, treating the business like a private coin jar, and when I brought it up, he and Paula turned the entire family against me. He told me how Paula had whispered to relatives that he drank too much, that he was unstable, that he made up stories when he felt insecure, and how those lies spread until no one returned his calls or invited him to gatherings, and eventually Ron pressured him into signing documents that removed him from any future inheritance claim, in the company disguising it as a mutual separation. He said he refused to sign a strict non-disclosure, and that was why they hated him most, because he walked away with knowledge they could not control. And after that, he was ghosted, erased from the narrative, just like the contribution memo had erased me. Then he reached into his worn backpack and pulled out a thin folder, sliding it across the table to me, saying, "I kept these because I knew someday someone might need them, and when I opened it, my breath caught because inside were copies of internal emails, statements, and drafts from the period when I had invested my money into the company documents that showed clearly how Ron and Paula had used that money to cover losses, how they had repositioned it in reports as a strategic contribution credited to Tyler, and how the board minutes referred to it as support provided by the Lee heir. And as I looked at the papers, another layer of betrayal clicked into place. This was not just a husband acting selfishly. This was an entire family treating my work and resources as their own, using my money, my marriage, even my daughter's future, as pieces in their legacy game, weaving a revenge, inheritance drama. Family narrative where only the Lee name mattered and everything else could be rewritten or absorbed. I thanked Mark, my voice shaking in a way I could not control, and he gave a sad smile telling me he hoped I would do what he had not been able to do, stand up to them before they took everything. Driving home from the diner, I felt a different kind of fire rising in me. Not the panic of discovery, but the deep, steady anger of someone who has finally seen the full map of the betrayal. When I arrived home, another small opportunity for revenge flickered into view when I saw an email from Paula asking the Scholar Bridge Board if the Lee Heating and Supply Scholarship proposal could be revisited, because she believed their family name would bring good publicity, and I forwarded the email privately to a colleague with a simple note expressing ethical concerns about mixing corporate interests with scholarship branding. And the board declined her request within a day, a quiet refusal that Paula would not be able to trace back to me, but that would frustrate her attempts to polish the family image. That night, as I sat by the window, watching the last light disappear from the yard, the words formed themselves with the same cold precision as the memo I had found. They did not just want to steal my marriage. They wanted to fold my money, my work, and even my child's future into their precious Lee legacy and erase my name from all of it, and knowing that truth made the path ahead feel unavoidable, because I could no longer pretend I was fighting a single man. I was fighting an entire system built on erasing me. I drove home from meeting Mark with a strange steadiness pressing into my ribs. Not calm exactly, but something sharper, something like alignment, because for the first time I saw the full machinery behind the Lee family and their careful erasures, and that clarity made it impossible to sit still. So the next morning, after dropping Emily at school, I opened my laptop, searched Kayla's name on LinkedIn, and felt my breath hitch when her profile had quietly vanished, replaced by a short note that said, "Resigned for personal reasons," which told me everything I needed to know about how fast Paula worked when she needed to clean up loose ends. I called Rachel, my friend at the college who kept quiet tabs on local job shifts, and she whispered that she had seen a girl who looked like Kayla working at a small cafe near a strip mall, and something about the image of that 26-year-old girl once polished and confident at company events, now serving drip coffee for minimum wage, pushed me to grab my keys and drive straight there, all while my mind replayed the purse under my bed and the hotel receipt and the constant hum of betrayal that had colored every corner of my home these past weeks. When I walked into the cafe, the smell of burnt espresso and old pastries clung to the air, and in the far corner behind the counter, I saw her hair pulled back in a messy knot face, pale and drawn shoulders tight with the kind of nervousness that comes from expecting danger at every turn. And when she looked up and recognized me, her eyes widened with pure panic as she whispered, "Please do not make a scene. I cannot lose this job too." I told her calmly, "I am not here to yell at you. I need you to tell me the truth," and the way her breath trembled told me she had been waiting for this moment, dreading it, maybe hoping for it too, because secrets like hers rot quickly when held alone. She led me to a small table outside her hands, shaking as she wrapped them around a paper cup, and after a long silence, she whispered that Tyler had promised her freedom, that he told her he would buy a condo in Cincinnati once everything was finalized, that the transfers he made were just temporary, that he needed to set up their future without raising questions. And as she spoke, her voice cracked under the weight of her own humiliation, because she realized now how foolish those promises had been. I asked her about Paula, and her expression shifted from shame to fear as she described how Paula had taken her aside one afternoon, speaking softly, offering guidance, warning her that I was unstable and emotional, and that if Kayla wanted any protection, she needed to sign a statement describing me as jealous, angry, capable of throwing things even dangerous to Emily. And Kayla admitted she had hesitated, that she had not wanted to lie, but Paula told her no one would hire a girl who went against this family. She said she never signed it, but the fear lingered until she finally quit. Then her voice dropped even softer as she told me the twist: she had never planned to reveal the thing she had been keeping as her own insurance, a short audio recording she made when Paula thought the door was closed. Paula explaining the plan for a clean break, a public announcement, a humiliating but necessary exit for Mara to preserve the company image. And when Kayla slid her phone across the table, I felt the first true surge of power I had experienced in weeks, because here was proof not just of betrayal, but of orchestration, an entire play written to erase me. I told her we needed to go see someone, and I drove her to Janet's office, where the older woman looked at her with the combination of sternness and compassion reserved for someone who has been both victim and accomplice. And Janet explained carefully that Kayla was not the villain here, that she had been pulled into a toxic family system where manipulation masqueraded as loyalty. And if she told the truth, she could protect herself legally and walk away with dignity. Kayla cried quietly, shoulders shaking, then whispered that she would help in any way she could because she wanted to be free of them too. And something in her voice made me realize how wide the damage of the Lee family stretched, how many people they had used in their quest to control every narrative. After leaving Janet's office, I drove to Hyde Park to meet Jasmine Ortiz, the longtime server who had known Rachel for years and had waited on the Lee family more times than she cared to remember. And when she saw me walk in, she nodded once with a look of recognition that made me feel seen in a way I had not felt in months. We sat in the corner booth as she told me quietly that she had watched countless displays of money and ego in that restaurant. Businessmen who smirked at their wives, young women brought in for secret dinners, older matriarchs performing charm for a captive audience. And she said that few families generated as much quiet dislike among staff as the Lees, because there was always a smell of humiliation around them, a sense that someone would be put in their place before dessert. I explained the full story, the anniversary plan, the expected public announcement, and she leaned back with a slow exhale and said she could help. Not illegally, not improperly, just by making sure doors were open at the right moment and timing worked in my favor, because she hated seeing women blindsided in that room. As we talked, I realized my quiet army was forming not from force, but from truth people who had been harmed or used or overlooked by the same family that had underestimated me for years. That night when I returned home, I began executing the micro-revenge steps Janet had recommended, the small but sharp disruptions that would begin chipping at Tyler long before the real storm arrived. And I logged into our shared accounts and removed his access to the credit card he used, the most quietly canceling the secondary cards that gave him the illusion of control. Then I changed the password on our streaming accounts, something petty but deeply satisfying, because it would annoy him in a way he could not articulate without sounding childish. I also stopped the autopay on his club membership, a monthly charge he bragged about to his friends, knowing that when the bill came due, he would have to deal with it himself. Over the next 48 hours, he stomped around the house, complaining about how everything seemed to break at once, swearing under his breath about incompetent banks or glitchy apps, never suspecting that the little inconveniences were only the tremors before the earthquake I was preparing. And as I watched him mutter and pace and complain, something settled inside me, a steady readiness that felt like the beginning of the end, because he still thought he was orchestrating my downfall, never realizing that the quiet army forming around me was stronger than anything he or his family had ever built. The night of the anniversary arrived with the kind of heavy stillness that made the air feel thicker as I walked into Hyde Park Steakhouse in downtown Columbus, a place where the lighting was always low and warm, the polished wood gleaming under soft chandeliers, and the sound of quiet, expensive conversations drifting through the main dining area. And I followed the host through the main floor toward the private room that Paula had booked, a room intentionally positioned with its door open just enough for diners in the main area to glance inside, which was exactly how she liked it. Because Paula thrived on audiences, on whispers, on curated appearances that reinforced her position in the small circle of local elites and church acquaintances. And when I stepped into the room, I saw her standing near the table with Ron, both of them dressed as if they were hosting a charity gala. Paula smoothing down the tablecloth with that performative attention to detail she used whenever she wanted to feel important. And in the center of the table sat a glossy gift bag with a tissue paper flower sticking out of the top. The same kind of bag that had once held birthday presents or holiday trinkets, but tonight held something far colder, a settlement packet and a mocking book titled something like How to Let Go Gracefully. And I watched as Paula tilted her head toward Tyler and murmured in a falsely soothing tone that he needed to stay calm, that he was the reasonable one, that I would cause a scene, because emotional women always did. I took my seat without responding, letting my heart slow to a steady beat while the server poured water, and for a few minutes we engaged in small talk that should have felt polite, but instead shimmered with that sharp undertone of cruelty they like to hide behind smiles, and Paula leaned forward with her usual sickly sweet voice as she said how exhausting it must be for Tyler to carry all the real financial responsibility, how impressive it was that he handled everything while I merely played with scholarships, and Ron added that in business and in family, there came a time when an anchor had to be cut loose, a dead weight had to be removed for stability, and though each barb landed like thin needles along my spine, I forced myself to keep my expression smooth, while Tyler watched me with a practiced mask of regret, as if he were about to perform something noble rather than premeditated. I noticed Jasmine shifting near the doorway at that moment, her steps deliberate as she adjusted the pacing of the courses, delaying dessert and slowing service just enough to create an unnatural pause in conversation, a silence that felt manufactured but convincing, and she glanced at me with the smallest tilt of her chin, the signal we had agreed on the quiet. It is time that passed between us like a current. Tyler stood, then lifting his champagne glass and tapping it lightly with a fork, so the delicate ring drew the attention of not just our table, but of a few nearby diners who turned their heads toward the open doorway, the exact scenario Paula wanted, because she enjoyed witnessing the fall of someone she deemed lesser. And Tyler began speaking in a voice that attempted warmth but carried rehearsed pity, telling the room that we had grown apart, that he would always care for me as the mother of his child, that sometimes the bravest act was to let each other go, and he paused for dramatic effect, preparing to say we are divorcing as if it were a gift he was bestowing. At that exact second, Jasmine stepped forward carrying the gift bag Paula had planted, placing it in front of me as if it were dessert, and I felt the room shift, diners glancing in eyes, curious, as if sensing they were about to witness something they would later whisper about. I stood slowly, not touching the bag, letting a small, almost amused smile rise to my lips as I said softly that it was funny because Tyler had brought a gift, but so had I. And I reached into my clutch and pulled out the small black purse that had once rested under my marriage bed, placing it gently on the table as though it were a centerpiece, opening it with deliberate care, and drawing out the folded hotel receipt, holding it between my fingers as I lifted my chin toward the doorway that Jasmine had now conveniently opened wider. Kayla stood there trembling but present, her eyes shimmering with fear and resolve, and she stepped inside the room in a way that made the air snap, her voice steady, despite her shaking hands as she said, "Paula Ron." I know I was supposed to disappear, but I decided not to, and the way Paula flinched gave me the first true taste of justice that night. I unfolded the hotel receipt, letting my voice ring clearly as I read the date and time, pointing out that it matched the night Tyler had claimed he was on a business trip in Chicago, although the hotel was in downtown Columbus and the room was booked for 2 guests, and I watched heads turn in the main dining area as people leaned just enough to catch the shape of the spectacle unfolding. Kayla stepped closer, her breath quick, but her words clean as she said that Tyler had promised her that night would be the beginning of their life together, that he had told her the transfers he made were setting them up, that Paula had reassured her she would be protected if she signed papers describing me as unstable. And she said it in a voice that carried the exhaustion of someone who had been manipulated and abandoned, a voice that cracked the careful image Paula had crafted for decades. The room fell into a frozen silence that seemed to expand outward as if the walls themselves wanted to recoil, and even the diners outside stopped chewing their forks, suspended as the hum of the restaurant dimmed under the weight of truth. Tyler tried to speak, but his voice faltered, cracking with panic rather than control, and Paula reached for her clutch as if she could change the outcome with a gesture. But it was too late because the scene she designed to humiliate me had become the scene that exposed them every part of their plan, unraveling in front of the very audience they had hoped to impress. For a long, suspended moment after Kayla's confession, the room felt like it was holding its breath, the hum of the main dining area softening into a faint murmur, as though the entire restaurant sensed the unraveling of something carefully constructed. And before Tyler or Paula could recover from the shock that twisted their faces into stiff masks of denial and panic, I saw a figure at the doorway, Mark stepping into the private room with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the chaos gathering in the air. His simple gray suit neat and pressed, his posture steady as he carried a slim folder under his arm. And as he approached the table, I watched Ron's eyes widen with the kind of fear reserved for ghosts. Because in their world, Mark was not supposed to exist anymore. He was the family member they erased, the one who knew too much. Mark placed the folder on the table in front of Ron without ceremony, sliding it across the polished surface with a quiet scrape that felt louder than any accusation. And he said in an even tone that carried years of buried resentment, "Do you recognize these? The emails where you turned Maris $250,000 into Tyler's contribution." And Ron opened the folder with rigid fingers, his face draining of color as he saw the printed emails, the accounting entries, the proof that the money they had bragged about as Tyler's sacrifice had come directly from me. I felt a heat rising in my chest, not anger exactly, but something like vindication, and I set down my own stack of papers next to Mark's, flipping through the printed bank statements, the neat rows of transfers, each one labeled temporary move, each one never returned, each one increasing the total until it reached $70,000. And I spoke clearly enough for the people in the main dining area to hear that Tyler had not only cheated on me, but had robbed his daughter's college fund to finance his affair, and a wave of murmurs rippled through the doorway as diners exchanged glances, their polite facades cracking under the weight of what they were witnessing. Kayla stepped closer, hands trembling slightly, unlocking her phone and pressing play on the audio file, and the familiar clipped voice of Paula filled the room cold and calculating as she explained the clean break, the public humiliation, the need to make me look unstable, so I could not fight them in court, and the sound of her voice echoing through the restaurant made several people freeze mid-bite because Paula had always been the smiling charity queen of the community, the woman who organized fundraisers and church brunches, and now they were hearing her openly plotting against her own daughter-in-law. Paula lunged forward as if she could snatch the phone away, but Kayla stepped back and the audio played on each second, shredding the polished image Paula had curated for decades, and I watched one of the diners in the main room whisper something to her husband, both of them turning away slightly, as if they wanted distance from the toxicity now spilling into the open. I straightened, feeling the room tilt in my favor for the first time in years, and in a calm, steady voice I announced that as of that morning, 50% of our joint liquid assets were now legally under my name alone, that my lawyer would file for divorce on Monday along with a request to freeze any moves Tyler attempted to make with the remainder of the funds, and I added that I had already restored Emily's college plan with my own money because my daughter would never pay the price for her father's betrayal. Ron slammed his hand on the table and shouted that I would ruin this family name, his voice cracking with desperation rather than authority. But before he could say more, I saw a man at a nearby table quietly stand up a banker who had worked with Ron in the past, and he excused himself from his dinner companion leaving the restaurant with a tight expression because he clearly recognized the financial and ethical disaster unfolding and wanted no part in it. Paula tried then to gather the remnants of her old strategy, attempting to adopt a sympathetic tone, as she said that I was hysterical, that I was being manipulated, that this was a misunderstanding, but her voice wavered under the weight of the audio clip, still replaying in every mind in the room, and even the server standing by the door kept her eyes lowered, not willing to lend Paula any silent support. The silence stretched brittle and full of judgment, and I turned toward Tyler, who looked like a man drowning in a storm. He thought he controlled his eyes, darting to the doorway to the diners, to his parents, then back to me, searching for a version of reality that would make this moment salvageable. But there was none. I reached for the glossy gift bag that Paula had so proudly placed on the table earlier, lifting the tissue paper and the book tucked inside, a self-help guide about letting go, with Grace a cruel and smug gesture, meant to mock me. And I held it up just long enough for Paula to meet my eyes before I set it back down gently in front of her, and said in a voice that carried every ounce of dignity they had tried to bury that she was right. It was time to let go, and I would start by letting go of the idea that she ever had power over me. The room went completely still, a thick silence hanging in the air as the final shift settled into place. And in that silence, I felt the full weight of the moment, the legal checkmate, the financial exposure, the social humiliation all converging in a single undeniable truth. The Lees had underestimated the wrong woman, and now everyone in their carefully cultivated social circle knew it. In the months that followed the night at Hyde Park, everything that had once felt immovable in the Lee family began to crack and collapse under the weight of their own choices. And when the divorce was finalized after a stretch of tense hearings and meticulous filings, I felt a strange exhale move through my body, not triumph exactly, but something steadier and deeper, something like returning to myself after years of being compressed into a shape that never fit, and the court ordered Tyler to sell a portion of his shares to cover legal fees and restitution a sale. He fought bitterly, but could not avoid. And watching him sign those papers with trembling hands was the first time I saw him realize that consequences were not abstract concepts meant only for other people. The company that Ron had once paraded as his legacy began to lose contracts after whispers of financial misconduct spread through local business circles, and when the IRS launched its routine review that year, the Lees found themselves scrambling to explain irregularities they had long brushed aside and their strained expressions in the courthouse hallway. The day my divorce decree was issued told me everything I needed to know about the gradual unraveling of the empire they had built on entitlement rather than integrity. Meanwhile, I moved into a modest but bright townhouse in a quiet corner of Westerville, a place with morning sunlight that warmed the living room and an evening breeze that carried the soft scent of pine from the trees behind the complex. And for the first time in years, I felt my space belonged to me, each piece of furniture chosen without compromise, each shelf holding books that reflected my own voice instead of the shadow of a family that had demanded my silence. I returned to the community college not as the quiet advisor tucked away in an office, but as the newly appointed director of financial aid, and stepping into that role felt like stepping into the person I had been building all along, the person the Lee family had never cared to understand because she did not fit their narrow idea of worth. With the dividends from Scholar Bridge continuing to flow steadily, I created a scholarship fund in my name and in Emily's, a fund designed to support first-generation students and single mothers navigating the same financial traps I had spent years helping others avoid. And signing the documents that established the fund felt like rewriting the meaning of inheritance itself, a declaration that legacy was something you built with intention and compassion, rather than something hoarded by bloodline gatekeepers. Emily grew older in those months, her teenage years marked by a maturity that softened me whenever I looked at her, and I told her the truth in layers appropriate to her age, explaining the betrayal in terms she could process, emphasizing that her future was safe because her mother had safeguarded what mattered. And one evening, as we drove home from her school, she looked at me with that direct, steady gaze she inherited from her grandmother on my side and said, "You turned Dad's betrayal into security for us. That is the only revenge I care about." And her words settled into me like a second heartbeat, steady and warm. The audacity of the Lee family did not disappear immediately, of course, because people like Paula rarely surrender their narratives without trying to rewrite the ending. And every so often I would receive a brief email or a terse text saying family should forgive or think of Emily's last name, as if forgiveness could be manipulated into restoring their image, or as if my daughter's identity needed to be tethered to a lineage that had tried to erase mine. And I would reply with the same calm sentence every time I am thinking of her, "That is why I will not let betrayal write our story." And I would feel the quiet satisfaction of drawing a boundary that once would have terrified me, but now felt like an act of love. With time, I began hosting free workshops for women in their 40s, 50s, and 60s sessions held in the college auditorium on Saturday mornings, where we talked about reading bank statements, understanding 529 plans, recognizing financial manipulation, and how to protect assets from spouses or families who felt entitled to them. And those workshops became a sanctuary for women who had spent decades being told they were overreacting, emotional, dependent, or naive, and seeing their faces brighten as they reclaimed their own knowledge made me realize that justice without hate was not only possible, but deeply healing, a form of revenge, emotional and story financial, that rewrote pain into empowerment. Sometimes after the workshops, I would sit on the wooden steps outside the building as the late afternoon sun dipped toward the horizon, letting the warmth settle on my skin, while I read the thank you emails sent by women who had avoided financial traps because of something they learned in my class, women who had confronted husbands or siblings or parents who had long controlled their futures. And in those quiet moments, I felt the full breadth of what rebuilding meant. One evening near the end of autumn, I sat on the porch of my townhouse wrapped in a soft sweater, the Ohio sky streaked with peach and rose colors as the crickets began to hum. And I opened an email from a woman in her 60s who wrote that she had avoided losing her retirement savings because she recognized signs of financial manipulation her son had used for years, and her gratitude poured into me with a depth that felt like a gentle echo of my own journey. And I realized that this was my closure, not destroying the Lee family, not proving them wrong, but ensuring that their kind of family betrayal never stole another woman's future. As the evening breeze brushed against my cheek, I thought to myself that the Lees had believed revenge meant breaking someone apart, but for me, it meant rebuilding what they tried to dismantle, choosing peace without surrender, choosing truth without cruelty, choosing a future rooted in strength that came from within rather than from those who demanded loyalty without giving any in return. And if this story touched you, if you have ever lived through toxic family dynamics, or family betrayal, or quietly endured financial control, I hope you remember that quiet justice does exist, and sometimes silent revenge is simply protecting your assets, protecting your children, and holding on to emotional resilience as you put dignity over money. If you want more stories like this, stories that carry lessons in betrayal and show what it looks like to stand up for yourself, to reclaim respect without hate, to find revenge through truth, I hope you will comment where you are watching from and subscribe so we can continue this journey toward truth and closure and justice without hate together.